Hegel's Philosophy of Mind, Part 1, The Subjective Mind, Subsection B, Phenomenology of Mind, Consciousness, Supersection B, Self-Consciousness, Metasection Beta, Self-Consciousness, Recognitive, das Anerkennende Selbstbewusstsein, or Selbstbewusstsein, again to be corrected in the outline. The pronunciation will be corrected in the outline. Self-consciousness. Encyclopedia section 430. Here there is a self-consciousness for a self-consciousness, at first immediately as one of two things for another. In that other as ego I behold myself, and yet also an immediately existing object, another ego absolutely independent of me and opposed to me. The suppression of the singleness of self-consciousness was only a first step in the suppression, and it merely led to the characterization of it as particular. This contradiction gives either self-consciousness the impulse to show itself as a free self and to exist as such for the other, the process of recognition. Encyclopedia section 431. The process is a battle. I cannot be aware of me as myself in another individual, so long as I see in that other an other and an immediate existence. And I am consequently bent upon the suppression of this immediacy of his. But in like measure, I cannot be recognized as immediate, except so far as I overcome the mere immediacy on my own part, and thus give existence to my freedom. But this immediacy is at the same time the corporeity of subconsciousness, in which, as in its sign and tool, the latter has its own sense of self and its being for others, and the means for entering into relation with them. Encyclopedia section 432. The fight of recognition is a life and death struggle. Either self-consciousness imperils the other's like and incurs a like peril for its own, but only peril, for either is no less bent on maintaining his life as the existence of his freedom. Thus, the death of one, though by the abstract, therefore rude negation of immediacy, it, from one point of view, solves the contradiction, is yet, from the essential point of view, in essence, the outward and visible recognition, a new contradiction. For that recognition is at the same time undone by the other's death, and a greater than the other. Encyclopedia section 433. But because life is as requisite as liberty to the solution, the fight ends in the first instance as a one-sided negation with inequality, while the one combatant prefers life, retains his single self-consciousness, but surrenders his claim for recognition. The other holds fast to his self-assertion and is recognized by the former as his superior. Thus arises the status of master and slave. In the battle for recognition and the subjugation under a master, we see, on the phenomenal side, the emergence of man's social life and the commencement of political union. Force, which is the basis of this phenomenon, is not on that account a basis of right, but only the necessary and legitimate factor in the passage from the state of subconsciousness, sunk in appetite and selfish isolation, into the state of universal self-consciousness. Force, then, is the external or phenomenal commencement of states, not their underlying and essential principle. Encyclopedia section 434. This status, in the first place, implies common wants and common concern for their satisfaction. For the means of mastery, the slave must likewise be kept in life. In place of the rude destruction of the immediate object, there ensues acquisition, preservation, and formation of it, as the instrumentality in which the two extremes of independence and non independence are welded together. The form of universality thus arising in satisfying the want creates a permanent means and a provision which takes care for and secures the future. Encyclopedia section 435. But secondly, when we look to the distinction of the two, the master beholds in the slave and his servitude the supremacy of his single selfhood, and that by the suppression of immediate selfhood, a suppression, however, which falls on another. This other, the slave, however, in the service of the master, works off his individualist self will, overcomes the inner immediacy of appetite, and in this divestment of self, and in the fear of his Lord, makes the beginning of wisdom, the passage to universal subconsciousness. Metasection Gamma, Universal Self-Consciousness. Encyclopedia section 436. Universal self-consciousness is the affirmative awareness of self in an other self. Each self as a free individuality has his own absolute independence, yet in virtue of the negation of its immediacy or appetite without distinguishing itself from that other. Each is thus universal, self-conscious, and objective. Each has real universality in the shape of reciprocity, so far as each knows itself recognized in the other free man, and is aware of this in so far as it recognizes the other and knows him to be free. The universal reappearance of self-consciousness, the notion which is aware of itself in its objectivity as a subjectivity identical with itself, and for that reason universal, Anamerata Habibi, is the form of consciousness which lies at the root of all true mental or spiritual life. In family, fatherland, state, and all virtues, love, friendship, val- valor, honor, fame. But this appearance of the underlying essence may be severed from the essential, but this appearance of the underlying essence may be severed from that essential and be maintained apart in worthless honor, idle fame, and the like. Encyclopedia section 437. This unity of consciousness and self-consciousness implies in the first instance the individuals mutually throwing light upon each other. But the difference between those who are thus identified is mere vague diversity, or rather, it is a difference which is none. Hence, its truth is the fully and really existent universality and objectivity of self consciousness, which is reason. Reason, as the idea, see Encyclopedia section 213, as it appears here, is to be taken as meaning that the distinction between notion and reality which it unifies has the special aspect of a distinction between the self concentrated notion or consciousness and the object subsisting external and opposed to it. Reason, as the idea, as it appears here, is to be taken as meaning that the distinction between notion and reality, which it unifies, has the special aspect of a distinction between the self concentrated notion or consciousness and the object subsisting external and opposed to it. Supersection C, reason, de Vernunft, Encyclopedia section 438. The essential and actual truth which reason is. The essential and actual truth which reason is lies in the simple identity of the subjective of the notion. The essential and actual truth which reason is lies in the simple identity of the subjectivity of the notion with its objectivity and universality. The universality of reason, therefore, whilst it signifies that the object, which was only given in consciousness qua consciousness, is now itself universal, permeating and encompassing the ego, also signifies that the pure ego is the pure form which overlaps the object and encompasses it without it. Encyclopedia section 439. Self consciousness thus certified that its determinations are no less objective. Self consciousness thus certified that its determinations are no less objective, or determinations of the very being of things, than they are its own thoughts in is reason. Self consciousness thus certified that its determinations are no less objective or determinations of the very being of things than they are its own thoughts is reason, which as such an identity is not only the absolute substance, but the truth that knows it. For truth here has, as its peculiar mode and eminent form, the self centered pure notion, ego, the certitude of self as infinite universality, truth, aware of what it is mind, spirit. Truth aware of what it is mind, spirit. Truth aware of what it is mind, spirit. Hegel, The Philosophy of Mind, Part 1, The Subjective Mind, Subsection C, Psychology, Mind, Der Geist. Encyclopedia section 440, Mind has defined itself as the truth of soul and consciousness. Mind has defined itself as the truth of soul and consciousness, the former a simple immediate totality, the latter now an infinite form which is not, like consciousness, restricted by that content, and does not stand in mere correlation to it as to its object, but is an awareness of this substantial totality, neither subjective nor objective. Mind, therefore, starts only from its own being and is in correlation only with its own features. Psychology, accordingly, studies the faculties or general modes of mental activity qua mental vision, ideation, remembering, and similar, desires, and similar, apart both from the content which on the phenomenal side is found in empirical ideation, in thinking also, and in desire and will, and from the two forms in which these modes exist, vis-a-vis, in the soul as a physical mode, and in consciousness itself as a separately existent object of that consciousness. This, however, is not an arbitrary abstraction by the psychologist. Mind is just this elevation above nature and physical modes, and above the complication with an external object, in one word, above the material, as its concept has just shown, as light permeating from a filament. All it has now to do is to realize this notion of its freedom and get rid of the form of immediacy with which it once more begins. The content which is elevated to intuitions is its sensations. It is its intuitions also which are transmuted into representations, and its representations which are transmuted again into thoughts and similar, into vision, ideation, remembering, desires. Encyclopedia section 441. The soul is finite, so far as its features are immediately or con-natural. Consciousness is finite insofar as it has an object. Mind is finite insofar as, though it no longer has an object, it has a mode in its knowledge. In essence, it is finite by means of its immediacy, or, what is the same thing, by being subjective or only a notion. Was that a wave or a particle? Well, I observed it, and it is a matter of no consequence, which is defined as its notion, and which, as the reality of its notion, say that its notion is the utterly infinite object say that its notion is the utterly infinite objective reason, then its reality is knowledge or intelligence. Say that knowledge is its notion, then its reality is that reason, and the realization of knowledge consists in appropriating reason. Hence, the finitude of mind is to be placed in the temporary failure of knowledge to get hold of the full reality of its reason, or equally in the temporary failure of reason to attain manifestation in knowledge. Reason at the same time is only infinite so far as it is absolute freedom. So far, that is, as presume again, reason at the same time is only infinite so far as it is absolute freedom. So far, that is, as presupposing itself for its knowledge to work upon it. It thereby reduces itself to finitude and appears as everlasting movement of superseding this immediacy, of comprehending itself and being a rational knowledge. Encyclopedia section 442. The progress of mind is development insofar as its existent phase, by view of knowledge, involves as its intrinsic purpose, and burden that utter and complete autonomy which is rationality. In which case, the action of translating this purpose into reality is strictly only a nominal passage over into manifestation, and is even there a return into itself, so far as knowledge, which has not shaken off its original quality of mere knowledge, is only abstract or formal. The goal of mind is to give its objective fulfillment and thus at the same time produce its freedom. The development here meant is not that of the individual, which has certain anthropological character, where faculties and forces are regarded as successively emerging and presenting themselves in external existence, a series of steps on the ascertainment on which there was for a long time great stress laid by the system of Condelic, as if a conjectural, natural emergence can exhibit the origin of these faculties and explain them. In Condelic's, Condillac, in Condelic's method, there is a In Condillac method, there is an unmistakable intention to show how the several modes of mental activity could be made intelligible without losing sight in mental unity, and to exhibit their necessary interconnection. But the categories employed in doing so are of a wretched sort. Their ruling principle is that the sensible is taken, and with justice, as the prius or the initial basis, but that the latter phases that follow this starting manner and the negative aspect of mental activity by which this material is transmuted into mind and destroyed as a sensible is misconceived and overlooked. As the theory of Kondelic states it, the sensible is not merely the empirical first, but is left as if it were the true and essential foundation. Similarly, if the activities of mind are treated as mere manifestations, forces, perhaps in terms stating their utility or suitability for other interests of head or heart, there is no indication of the true final aim of the whole business. That can only be intelligible unity of mind, and its activity can only have itself as aim. In essence, its aim can only be to get rid of the form of immediacy or subjectivity, to reach and get hold of itself, and to liberate itself to itself. In this way, the so called faculties of mind, as thus distinguished, are only to be treated as steps of this liberation, and this is the only rational mode of studying the mind and its various activities. Encyclopedia section 443. As consciousness has for its object the stage which preceded it, the natural soul, see Encyclopedia section 413. So mind has, or rather makes consciousness its object. In essence, whereas consciousness is only the virtual identity of the ego with its other, again Encyclopedia 415, the mind realizes that identity as the concrete unity which it and it only knows. Its productions are governed by the principle of all reason that the contents are at once potentially existent, mumkinat, and are the mind's own in freedom. Thus, if we consider the initial aspect of mind, that aspect is twofold, as being and as its own. By the one, the mind finds in itself something which is; by the other, it affirms it to be only its own. The way of mind is, therefore, A, to be theoretical. It has to do with the rational as its immediate affection, which it must render its own, or it has to free knowledge from its presupposedness and therefore from its abstractness, and make the affection subjective. When the affection has been rendered its own, and the knowledge consequently characterized as free intelligence, in essence, as having its full and free characterization in itself, it is B, will, the lemma, practical mind, which in the first place is likewise formal in essence. Its content is at first only its own, and is immediately willed, and it proceeds next to liberate its volition from its subjectivity, which is the one sided form of its contents, so that it, C, confronts itself as free mind and thus gets rid of both its defects and one sidedness. Encyclopedia section 444, 444. The theoretical as well as the practical mind still fall under the general range of subjective mind. They are not to be distinguished as active and passive. The theoretical as well as practical mind still fall under the general range of mind subjective. The theoretical and practical fall under the general range of mind subjective. They are not to be distinguished as active and passive. Subjective mind is productive, but it is a merely nominal productivity. In words, the theoretical mind produces only its ideal world and gains abstract autonomy within. While the practical, while it has to do with autonomous products, with a material which is its own, has a material which is only nominally such, and therefore a restricted content for which it gains the form of universality. Outwards, the subjective mind, which as a unity of anthropological and conformable to consciousness, again, outward, the subjective mind, which as a unity of soul and consciousness, is thus also a reality at once anthropological and conformable to consciousness, has for its products in the theoretical range the word, and in the practical not yet deed and action but enjoyment. Psychology, like logic, is one of those sciences which in modern times have yet derived least profit from the more general mental culture and the deeper conception of reason. It is still extremely ill off. The turn which the Kantian philosophy has taken has given it greater importance. It has, and that in its empirical condition, been claimed as the basis of metaphysics, which is to consist of nothing but the empirical apprehension and the analysis of the facts of human consciousness merely as facts, just as they are given. This position of psychology, mixing it up with forms belonging to the range of consciousness and with anthropology, has led to no improvement in its own condition. But it has had the further effect that, both for the mind as such and for the metaphysics, the philosophy generally, all attempts have been abandoned to ascertain the necessity of essential and actual reality, to get at the notion and the truth. A observation by the reader, Christopher Robert Neal, Juris Doctorate. Of all the things that were said just now, the one that sticks out is, as you hear me read this, and as I go back and summarize it, the knowledge that you hear here from Hegel becomes universal and then becomes mine specifically, and then I present it to you. So I intend to add this, the outline, to a greater work, or some would say another work, called the Philosopher, which is the Bezels of Wisdom, a take by a Spanish descendant, a Spanish man of the court of Andalusia, who also lived in Syria and traveled many other places, who tells the stories of each individual Hebrew and a few Arabic prophets and wise men as an example of various geniuses, genus locorum, of the places where they were, who fit Hegel's model. And then Hegel's also admitting that this came from somewhere else, and that at least the one presenting it to you should know where it came from. And where does it come from? It comes from the Pali Canon of Theravada Buddhism and is, therefore, Mahayana Buddhism when you hear it. And so this is what is being spoken of. And so the genius that is being spoken of throughout the phenomenology of mind and the philosophy of mind, or at least the philosophy of mind, is the Bodhisattva. So you can argue that the philosophy of mind is Theravedic Buddhism, and the phenomenology of mind is Mahayana Buddhism. And I, the reader, am have learned through genetic testing that I am a Kshatriya Brahmin, uh, a permutation more Kshatriya than Brahmin. And the essential part of that is that Siddhartha Gautama was also a Kshatriya Brahmin. And so I have intimate relationship with the concepts that are presented here. And I hope that they are beneficial to you and that the outline is beneficial, but the outline will eventually be collapsed into my own Hegelian, Theravedic, Mahayanan, Kshatriya, uh, quasi-Brahmanic text, which I hope to, I'm inspired to do, and I hope to present in about 10 more years.